y'all, welcome back and thanks for stopping by. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie and today I have 5 gorgeous woodland themed Christmas DIYs for y'all. So let's go ahead and jump right in. DIY number 1 is a pair of reindeer shelf sitters. For this project I started with 2 of the glittery reindeer ornaments from Dollar Tree. I started by removing the embellishments from the necks of both of the reindeer and set them aside so that I could use them later on in this project. I then took a piece of scrap cardboard and using a tiny dab of hot glue on the bottom of the reindeer's feet, glued them to the cardboard so that they would be easier to paint. I made sure to not use too much glue because I wanted to be able to easily remove them from the cardboard once they were painted. Then I took them outside and gave them both a couple coats of Rust-Oleum metallic spray paint in flat burnished amber. While the reindeer were drying, I took a 2-pack of round floral foam and a microfiber car cleaning cloth, both from Dollar Tree, and created a couple of bases for the reindeer to stand on. The first thing I did was take a pair of sharp scissors and cut the finished edges off of the microfiber cloth. Once I had the edges removed from the cloth, I made sure the fuzziest side of the cloth was showing and used hot glue to glue it to one side of the foam circle. I made sure to leave enough of the cloth hanging over the edges of the circle so that I could go back and hot glue it around the sides for a nice finished look. I did not worry about covering the bottom of the circles with the cloth since they would not be seen. After I had the cloth glued down to the top of the circle, I took a pair of scissors and cut away the rest of the cloth, again making sure I had plenty of cloth hanging over the sides so I could completely cover the sides of the foam. I then used hot glue to glue the cloth to one side of the circle. I made sure to pull the cloth tight so that it wouldn't be too loose or have any wrinkles. I wanted a nice smooth finished look. Once I had one circle completely covered with the cloth, I repeated the process to cover the other foam circle. When I had both circles covered with the cloth, I cut off any of the excess cloth that was left hanging over the edges. Once the reindeer were completely dry, I carefully removed them from the cardboard and used a generous amount of hot glue to glue them in the center of the circle so that it would look like they were standing in snow. Since I wanted it to look like the reindeer were actually walking through the snow, I took some of the scrap pieces of microfiber cloth and hot glued it around the reindeer's feet that were touching the base. All I did was cut a small round piece of the microfiber cloth and then cut a V in it so that it would easily go around the leg, and then just hot glued it around the leg and the foot, making sure the fuzzy side was up. I did try to push the cloth together in a way so that it would look like the snow was coming up just a little bit over the hooves. I used this method to cover the feet on both reindeer. Once I was happy with how the reindeer looked on the snow, I took the embellishments that I took off of the reindeer before I painted them and removed the bow and the berries. Then I used one of the holly berries floral pick from Dollar Tree and pulled off one of the bunches of berries. I trimmed down the back of the berries so that they would sit flat in the center of the greenery. I also trimmed off any of the old hot glue that I could that was left over from where I removed the original ribbon and berries. Then I hot glued the bunch of berries in the center of the greenery, and then I glued it all onto the neck of the reindeer. I tried to get it as close to the original placement as I could. I then repeated the same steps to put the other embellishment on the other reindeer. And that was it for this first DIY. It was really simple and pretty quick to take these 2 reindeer ornaments from Dollar Tree and turn them into perfect woodland themed decor pieces for this holiday season. I want to take just a second to tell y'all about this wonderful playlist I'm co-hosting today, along with 3 other incredibly talented ladies, Amanda, Missy, and Tammy, along with this month's Spotlight Crafter, Maxine, over at Maxine Loves Crafts. You really don't want to miss all the wonderful projects on this month's playlist. The theme is either woodland Christmas or vintage Christmas decor, so when you're finished watching this video, hop on down to the description box below and check out the link to the playlist along with the links to all the other co-hosts in the Spotlight Crafter for even more Christmas and holiday inspiration. Moving on to DIY number 2, a metal Merry Christmas tree holder with a flock tree. For this project, I started with an empty coffee can that I had on hand. The first thing I did was remove the label. It was really easy to remove using a heating tool on the highest setting to melt the glue that was holding the label to the can. Please be careful while doing this because the metal will heat up quickly and will burn you. If you don't have a heat tool, you could also use a hairdryer on the highest setting. Once the label was removed, I was left with a sticky can, so I soaked the can in warm soapy water and used a Brillo pad to remove the sticky residue. After I had the can nice and clean, I took it outside and gave it a couple coats of Rust-Oleum metallic spray paint in the color flat burnished amber. Once the can was completely dry, I brought it back inside and used my Cricut to cut out a vinyl decal that I had made. I centered the vinyl decal as best as I could and put it onto the coffee can. If you don't have a vinyl cutting machine, you could use stickers, stencils, or even freehand the design onto your coffee can. To create the tree to go inside the can, I used 2 of the green artificial Christmas trees from Dollar Tree. First, I removed both of the plastic bases that hold the feet of the trees. Then I moved all the tree branches to one side of the tree. I did this to both trees, but made sure the branches on one tree were all facing to the left and the branches on the other tree were all facing to the right. Once I had all the branches moved, I took 3 large zip ties from Dollar Tree and zip tied the 2 trees together, making sure to pull the zip ties tight. After I had the trees attached together, I went back and cut off the excess tails from the zip ties. Next, I replaced one of the bases onto one of the trees along with the feet so that the tree would stand on its own. Then I shaped the tree so that it was nice and fluffy and actually looked like a full Christmas tree. Once I had the tree shaped, I took it outside and used Krylon Fusion spray paint in gloss white and misted it lightly over the branches just enough so that it looked like there was a little bit of snow on them. To finish off this project, I used one of the green floral foam pieces from Dollar Tree, burlap I had on hand from Walmart, and some twine from Dollar Tree. I removed the tree from the base and stuck the trunk of the tree down into the floral foam. Then I used some of the burlap to cover up the foam in the trunk of the tree. I then used some of the twine to tie the burlap to the tree. I wanted a little more of the burlap to be showing around the tree, so I took some more burlap and placed it inside the coffee can. Then I placed the tree inside. Then I trimmed up the burlap around the outside of the can until I was happy with the way it looked and you could still see the decal on the front. I do love how this little tree and planter turned out. It's not so bad for something that was headed to the trash. I think it really brings a rustic feel to my holiday decor. Let's go ahead and get on into DIY number 3. This little faux fur reindeer just happens to be my favorite out of today's projects. For this project, I used 3 brown faux fur sheets that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby. To create the body of the reindeer, I used 1 full sheet of the faux fur. I folded the first sheet in half and used hot glue to glue the edges of the fur together. I hot glued one end and the side together completely, but left one of the ends opened a bit so that I could stuff the body with polyfill. Please be careful and watch your fingers because the glue can seep through this fur. I would definitely recommend using finger protectors if you have them. I used hot glue for this project and it worked great, but you could sew it if you'd like. I used some polyfill that I had in my stash to stuff the body of the reindeer. I used small handfuls at a time and kind of fluffed up the polyfill before putting it inside the fur. I made sure to stuff the body enough so that it would look nice and full, making sure to get in all the corners where the fur was glued together. Once the body was stuffed with the polyfill, I pushed the stuffing back far enough inside so that I could close the opening. I folded the edges of the fur inside and used hot glue to glue it together. You will have to hold the seam closed for about 10 seconds so that the glue will have time to set up. After I glued the opening shut and gave the hot glue enough time to fully set up, I went back and pushed in all the corners that were sticking out using my fingers and a paintbrush. The only corner I wanted to be sticking out was the one in the top rear of the body for the reindeer's little tail. To make the head and neck of the reindeer, I used another fur sheet. I folded the sheet in half and cut it so that I would have 2 pieces that were roughly the same size. Once I had the fur cut, I took a straight stick from my yard and decided about how long the neck should be and cut it to size. In the front part of the body, I cut a small slit in the fur so that I could insert the stick that was going to help stabilize the neck of the reindeer. With the stick in place, I took one of the pieces of fur and wrapped it around the stick, letting it overlap the back and sides of the body just a little bit. When I was happy with the placement of the fur, I used hot glue to glue the neck to the body and to close up what will become the back of the neck. I made sure to leave the top of the neck open so I could stuff it with polyfill. I then used more polyfill to stuff the neck until I was satisfied with how it looked. Once I was happy with the amount of polyfill in the neck, I again used hot glue to close up the opening. To attach the head of the reindeer, I took the other piece of fur and placed it over the neck with the longest hair facing the back side of the reindeer. I then used hot glue to glue it to the neck. I use the Gorilla Glue hot glue sticks for all of my projects and it works extremely well. I've never had any issues with it once it's completely set up. They're my absolute favorite hot glue sticks to use. I wanted the seam under the chin of the reindeer to look nice and clean, so I folded the edges of the fur inside the head and used hot glue to hold it in place. Then I used hot glue to attach the 2 ends. This gave me the nice finished looking seam that I wanted. Again, I left the front of the head open so that I could fill it with polyfill. Then I filled the head with the polyfill until I was happy with the way it looked. Once I was happy with the way the head looked, I then closed up the opening. Again, I wanted a nice clean look, so I folded the edges inside the head and hot glued them. And then I hot glued the finished end so that you wouldn't be able to find the seam once it was completely closed. To finish the body of the reindeer, I pushed in all the pointed edges on the body except for the one that was going to be the tail. You can do this with your fingers, but I found that it was much easier and quicker to use the end of a paintbrush. To make the ears, I took a piece from another fur sheet, folded it in half, and cut out 2 ear-shaped pieces. Once I had the ear shapes cut, I used hot glue to glue each of the ears together. I did not need to stuff the ears since they were fluffy enough by themselves. After I had the ears glued together, I used a pair of scissors to shape them and make them look more like reindeer ears. I decided where I wanted the ears to be on the head and moved the fur so that I could see the mesh underneath. I then used a generous amount of hot glue to attach the ears. I tried to get them as even as possible, but I didn't worry about them being perfect. I did have to hold the ears in place for about a minute until the glue set up enough to hold them standing up straight. I noticed that you could see a couple of bald spots on the ears, so I used some of the fur that I'd cut off and some hot glue to cover them up. After the glue had set up, I reshaped the ears. After I had the body completely assembled, I went in and trimmed up some of the fur around the face where I would be putting the nose and some of the other areas of the body where the fur was a little too long. I made sure to leave the fur longer on the tail area since I wanted it to stick up a bit. For the reindeer's legs, I went out in the yard and picked up 4 sticks that were roughly the same thickness and cut them all to 9 inches long. I cut a small slit on the side of the reindeer and inserted the leg. I put the leg in first to make sure it was positioned correctly and looked the way that I wanted it to. I then removed it, added some hot glue, and put it back in, that way it would be secure and not fall out. I repeated this process on all 4 legs, trying to get them as even as possible. I went outside again and found a small piece of a tree branch that I thought looked like antlers and used it for the antlers. I cut a slit in the top of the head right between the ears and inserted the antlers to make sure they fit nicely. I then removed them and added some hot glue and put them back in. The glue probably was not necessary since they fit snug, but I wanted the added security. I used a scrap piece of a red and black buffalo check handkerchief for the scarf. All I did was fold the fabric over on itself twice and use a tiny dab of hot glue on each of the ends to hold it together. I then wrapped it around the reindeer's neck and overlapped the 2 pieces on one side of the neck and hot glued it in place. To finish the scarf, I trimmed off the ends where I hot glued them together and then made tiny slits all the way across the end to give it that frayed look of a scarf. For the nose, I used one of the large red berries from a package I picked up at Dollar Tree. I scraped off some of the fake snow, but I wanted to leave just a little bit on there to give the nose some texture. I then gave it 1 coat of apple barrel paint in the color black. Once the nose was dry, I removed the wire from the berry and used hot glue to attach it to the reindeer. I then went in and trimmed up the fur around the nose and the face. Y'all, I'm so in love with how this reindeer turned out. I actually named him Prancer, but I think he is so unique and different. It only took about an hour or so to put him together, and he fits in perfectly with my woodland-themed Christmas decor. This one is my favorite DIY from today's video, and I'm thinking he needs a smaller friend, so I'll be making another shorter one soon. Now let's get started on DIY number 4, a bundle of faux birch logs. For this project, I used 1 pool noodle that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I started by cutting the pool noodle into 12-inch pieces. I was able to get 3 12-inch pieces out of 1 pool noodle. I did trim up the ends so that they would be as flat and even as possible. To cover the pool noodles to look like the birch logs, I used 3 pieces of birch scrapbook paper I picked up at Hobby Lobby. I wrapped the scrapbook paper around the pool noodle just enough so that it was barely overlapping to completely cover the foam. I then marked it with a pencil so I would know where to cut the scrapbook paper and cut it to size. Next, I used the extra piece of scrapbook paper that I cut off to trace around the ends of the pool noodle to make the end caps for the logs. I did figure out later that this wasn't the best way to get the right size end cap, so I did switch over to using the bottom of a paper coffee cup that was just a tad bit larger than the end of the pool noodle. After I had the end caps traced, I cut them out. Once I had all the pieces cut out, I wrapped the paper around the log so that the side I cut would be hidden by the straight factory cut. I then used hot glue to glue the scrapbook paper to the pool noodle. I only used hot glue along the seam line so that it wouldn't melt the rest of the foam. The hot glue worked great for me and it was much quicker than waiting for Mod Podge or other adhesives to dry, but if you wanted to use another adhesive, you could. I put a little bit of hot glue on the end of the pool noodle as well as around the edges of the scrapbook paper that was already on the pool noodle to attach the end caps to the logs. I found that the quickest and easiest way to do this was to apply the hot glue and leave the scrapbook paper face down on the table and center the end of the pool noodle down on top of it. Once the glue had set up on the end cap, I took a pair of sharp scissors and trimmed up any of the scrapbook paper that was visible around the edges of the foam. I then repeated these steps to cover the other 2 remaining pool noodles. After I had all 3 logs made, I hot glued 2 logs together for the base and then the other log on top to create a stack. I wanted this to look like a real stack of birch wood on my mantle, so I used some of the thinner nautical rope from Dollar Tree and wrapped it once around each end of the stack using hot glue to hold it in place. I also went back and reinforced the 2 logs on the bottom with some extra hot glue. That's it for this one. It was super quick and very simple to make this stack of birch logs. I think they look fantastic and they are so lightweight that I can use them just about anywhere. Best of all, it only cost about $3 for the bundle. Moving on to the last DIY, a set of LED birch candles. For this project, I used a set of 5 LED candles that I picked up on sale at Hobby Lobby for about $5 and 3 more pieces of the birch scrapbook paper that I used in the last DIY. I started by measuring out how big I needed the paper to be to fit completely around the candles. I wanted to make sure that I was able to overlap a little bit along the seam line to give it a more finished look. Once I had it measured out, I marked it with a pencil and cut it out. Next, I wrapped the paper back around the candle and marked where I needed to cut so that it was just a little bit longer than the candle. I then repeated these steps using the other 4 candles. Once I had the paper cut to size, I used a foam brush and gloss Mod Podge to adhere the paper to the candle. I used a nice layer of Mod Podge and applied the paper cut side first, making sure the factory cut edge was even with the bottom of the candle. I then continued applying the Mod Podge and paper all the way around the candle. I tried to get most of the wrinkles out of the paper, but I did leave a few so that it would look more realistic, because real wood with bark is rarely ever completely smooth. I then used the same process to cover the remaining 4 candles with the scrapbook paper. After I had all 5 candles covered with the paper and the Mod Podge was completely dry, I went back with more Mod Podge and sealed the outside of the paper with a nice coat, making sure not to leave any large globs of the Mod Podge on the outside of the candles. To finish off this set of birch candles, once the Mod Podge was completely dry, I took some sandpaper and sanded off all the excess paper that was sticking over the top of the candles. I used sandpaper because it gives a nicer, cleaner edge, and it was easier to get around the jagged edges of the top of the candles. I am absolutely thrilled with how this set of birch candles turned out. I styled them on one of the red Christmas chargers from Dollar Tree along with some Christmas florals that I had in my stash. These candles were so quick and easy to make, and they cost less to make at $7 than if I were to go out and buy a 5-piece set of LED birch candles. Besides, crafting them myself was much more fun than just going out and buying them. Here is one final look at all of today's woodland themed Christmas projects. I am so in love with how all 5 of these projects turned out. My favorite is the fur reindeer. Which one is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help out my channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Click that little red button and stick around. I have so many fun ideas for this upcoming holiday season and you don't want to miss them. Don't forget to check out the playlist in the description box below for even more woodland and vintage inspired decor. Thanks for watching and I'll see y'all next time.